What would you do if the person stealing from your family was the one everyone trusted the most? I'm Marcus, 33, and I run logistics for a mid-size freight company outside Columbus. Nothing flashy. Paid off Jeep, a modest rental, and a savings account I actually check every month instead of just glancing at the total. I didn't grow up with money. My father died when I was 20, and it was my grandmother who held the rest of us together after that. She was the one who showed up to every school event, who covered groceries when things got thin, who never once made either of us feel like a burden. When she passed 4 years ago, she left something behind that mattered more than any of us admitted out loud. A $200,000 trust, split evenly, half for me, half set aside strictly for my brother Derek's daughter Bailey to use for college. Derek and I were named co-trustees together. I didn't fight him on handling the paperwork. He liked being the one in charge of things, always had, and honestly, I had a job that ate 60 hours a week, and I was relieved someone else wanted the spreadsheets. That decision would come back, to haunt me in ways I never saw coming. On paper, Derek's life looked like a magazine spread. New construction house in one of those subdivisions with a name like a golf resort, a leased Audi every 2 years, weekend trips with Bailey whenever. School let out for even 3 days. His marriage to Bailey's mother, Priya, had ended about 18 months earlier, and since then, he'd leaned hard into what I can only describe as guilt-fueled generosity: designer sneakers, an iPad, a phone worth more than my first paycheck, a closet that looked like a showroom. I never said a word about any of it. It was his money to spend on his kid, or so I believed. That's the thing about family. You extend credit on trust that you'd never extend anywhere else, and you don't notice you're doing it until the bill comes due. Then came Bailey's 12th birthday. Derek rented an entire indoor go-kart and arcade venue, catered the whole thing with a taco bar and a soft serve machine, ordered a cake shaped like a race car with her name airbrushed across the hood. I showed up with something I'd actually thought about. Bailey had mentioned months earlier wanting to get into rock climbing after a school trip to an indoor gym. She'd talked about it for a solid 10 minutes at a family dinner, more animated than I'd seen her in a while, and nobody else seemed to be listening. So I went and bought her a beginner harness kit, proper shoes in her size, and a punch card for 10 sessions at the local climbing center. Maybe $300 total, but it came from actually paying attention to something she said, which felt like it should count for more than a price tag. She tore through her gifts fast. Thank you. Next box. Thank you. Next box. That assembly line rhythm kids fall into at a big party, until she got to mine. She looked at the harness, glanced at the price tag still stuck to the bag because I'd forgotten to peel it off, and said, loud enough for the whole party to hear, "Is this supposed to be a joke?" A couple of the other parents actually turned around. The room didn't go dead silent, but conversations definitely paused. That awkward half-beat where everyone pretends they didn't hear something they absolutely heard. Derek laughed. Actually, laughed out loud in front of 20 kids and their parents, and said, "Yeah, she's used to a little more than that, man." Like it was a bit we were doing together. Like I was in on the joke instead of being the punchline. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene beyond the one already happening. I picked the gift bag back up off the table. Bailey's face dropped instantly. "Wait, what are you doing?" "Taking it back," I said, calm, because rage doesn't need volume to land, since it's clearly beneath her. Then I looked at Derek. She must be really let down having you as a father. I walked out before he could say anything, drove home with my hands tight on the wheel the whole way, and called my coworker Priyanka, who'd heard every Derek story I had for the last 6 years and never once told me I was overreacting. Her answer was immediate. That kid didn't invent that attitude on her own. You know exactly where it came from. She wasn't wrong. But it still didn't sit easy. Hearing a 12-year-old talk like that, and knowing I'd have to be the villain in that memory. For a while, my mother called 2 hours later, furious, not at Derek, at me. "You humiliated that child in front of her friends. Do you understand what you did?" I told her what Bailey said, what Derek said back, and asked what exactly I was supposed to do differently. Stand there and smile while my niece and my brother turned my gift into a punchline. She landed on the line I should have expected, the one she always reaches for. "Your brother's been through a lot since the divorce, Marcus. He's trying." I said goodnight and hung up before I said something I couldn't walk back. That night, lying awake, something nagged at me that had nothing to do with the party. The house, the leases, the birthday spend that had to be pushing. 5 figures for one afternoon. Derek worked in medical equipment sales. Decent money, respectable even, but not that decent. Not on one income, not with a mortgage that size and a car payment on top of it. I hadn't looked closely at the trust statements he'd been emailing me every January in years, just skimmed. The total saw a number that looked roughly right and moved on with my life. So I opened my laptop at 1 in the morning and actually checked the bank portal directly, instead of trusting his PDF summaries like I'd been doing on autopilot. The numbers didn't match. Not close. According to Derek's reports, we should have had roughly $180,000 left after normal expenses. The accountant's fee, a maintenance charge, the small distribution we'd both agreed on early for Grandma's final medical bills. That part tracked fine. The real balance sitting in the account was $134,000. $46,000 gone, spread across withdrawals I'd never approved, irregular amounts, $5,000 here, $8,000 there, spaced out just enough over 2 years that they didn't scream pattern unless you were actually looking, each one carrying both trustee signatures, including mine, which I never signed, not once. I'm not a careless person. I run multi-million-dollar shipping schedules for a living, coordinate, fleets across 4 states without dropping a ball. But I'd treated my brother like family first, and a co-trustee second, and that gap is exactly where he'd been operating for 2 years while I signed off on nothing more than a January glance. I called Warren Feld, the attorney who'd handled Grandma's estate for decades, now semi-retired above a hardware store downtown with a waiting room that smelled like old carpet and coffee. I brought my laptop and printouts of the actual transaction history. He laid the paperwork out side by side on his desk, put on his glasses, and studied the signatures for a long stretch without saying anything, long enough that I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Then he looked up. "Marcus, that's not your handwriting. Not even close." He'd only ever been copied on 3 legitimate distributions, totaling about $12,000. Everything else, $34,000 worth, had bypassed him entirely, submitted straight to the bank on forms he'd never seen or approved. Half that account was protected specifically for Bailey's education, Warren said, taking his glasses off and rubbing the bridge of his nose. If he's been pulling from the whole pool instead of just his own half, he's not just stealing from you. He's stealing from his own kid's future, and I don't think he's thought about it in those terms even once. That line sat with me the whole drive home. 2 days later, Derek called. Not about the money, about the party. Bailey felt terrible, he said, wanted to apologize properly. Why didn't I come over for a makeup dinner, steaks on the grill, put the whole thing behind us like brothers do? I knew exactly why he was calling. Parents at that party had clearly told him his daughter looked spoiled and entitled, and he needed to manage the story before it spread further through the school pickup line. I went anyway, played along, ate. His steak listened to Bailey deliver a clearly rehearsed apology, the kind where you can hear the coaching in the pauses, and clocked a bank envelope sitting open on his desk when I passed his office on the way to the bathroom. Over dinner, he mentioned taking Bailey to Turks and Caicos that summer, Ocean View Suite, the whole package. My mother gushed about it, said the poor girl deserves something nice after everything with Priya. I thought about the missing 46 grand sitting in a ledger somewhere, thought about Bailey's college fund quietly funding a beach vacation she'd forget in 5 years, and smiled and said it sounded lovely. The following Monday, Warren called with new information. A pending $15,000 withdrawal request sitting in the queue, both signatures attached. Mine forged again, dated for later that same week. If it processed, it would drop. The account below the threshold where Bailey's education allocation started taking the hit directly instead of the general fund absorbing it. We moved fast. An emergency hold request to the bank, a formal dispute letter drafted that same afternoon, and a full audit request for every withdrawal made since Grandma's death. Warren's advice was simple and a little unnerving. Act completely normal, don't tip him off, let him think the dinner had smoothed things over. If Derek thought I was on to him, he could move money, destroy paperwork, or build a story before we had everything locked down. So I kept texting Derek back with thumbs-ups and half-interested replies about golf clubs and vacation photos, went to Bailey's soccer games and sat next to my mother in the bleachers while she beamed about her sons finally getting along again. At one of those games, Derek leaned over during a break and mentioned he was thinking about private middle schools for Bailey, good STEM programs, the kind with a robotics lab, and wondered aloud if he could just pull from the education fund this summer to cover application fees and a deposit. He asked what I thought, sitting right next to the man whose signature he'd been forging for 2 years straight, casual as asking about the weather. "Let's run it by Warren first," I said, eyes on the field. "Do it properly this time." He hesitated for just a beat too long, then agreed, and changed the subject to my job site like nothing had happened. 2 weeks later, Warren's office had the full audit spread across his conference table, every form organized by date. 11 forged withdrawal authorizations over 22 months, totaling $52,000. A handwriting analyst had already reviewed the samples and confirmed what was obvious the moment you looked closely. Derek is right-handed. I'm left-handed, and the slant on every single signature gave him away instantly, consistent as a signature machine. Bank statements traced the money straight to Derek's personal checking account, and a credit card balance loaded with resort bookings, lease payments, new furniture for the house, and a $4,000 charge at a jewelry store I still haven't asked him about. $19,000 of what he'd taken had come directly out of Bailey's education allocation, not his own half at all. Warren filed a petition to remove Derek as co-trustee, citing breach of fiduciary duty, backed by the forged documents, the handwriting, analysis, and the bank's own internal findings, which had confirmed the discrepancies independently of anything we'd submitted. He was served on a Tuesday morning at his front door, in front of Bailey. By Thursday afternoon, he was calling me 4 times in a row while I stood in a warehouse reviewing a shipment manifest with my foreman standing right there giving me a look. When I finally called back on my lunch break, his voice had that scared, tight edge to it I'd never heard from him before. Some lawyer just handed me papers in front of Bailey. What is this, Marcus? 11 forgeries, $52,000. Keep telling me you didn't do anything. He tried. I signed on your behalf. You gave me authority to handle things. Then pivoted to, I was going to pay it back, I swear. Then, when neither landed, went for blood, the way he always does when the facts run out. This isn't about the money, it's about control. It's always been about you resenting that Bailey loves me more, that Mom takes my side, that I have a family and you don't. I'd known him my whole life. I knew exactly what he did when cornered. Swing at whatever's personal, because there's nothing left to argue with. I told him to talk to Warren from now on, and hung up, sat in my truck in the parking lot for a while afterward, hands shaking a little more than I expected. My mother called that night insisting it had to be a misunderstanding, that Derek would never do something like that. Derek had apparently told her vaguely weeks earlier that he'd borrowed a little and planned to put it back before anyone noticed. She hadn't known the real number, hadn't known about the forged signatures at all. I believed her, mostly because her voice cracked in a way that's hard to fake over the phone, and partly because that's exactly how Derek operated. Give Mom just enough to keep her from asking real questions, then let her instinct to protect her son do the rest of the work for him. The hearing happened on a Thursday morning in a small probate courtroom that looked nothing like television. Fluorescent lights, a tired-looking judge, folding chairs instead of the polished benches you'd expect. Derek showed up with a lawyer who looked freshly briefed, maybe an hour into the case at most. He wouldn't meet my eyes once. My mother sat alone in the back row with her purse in her lap, staring straight ahead like she was at a funeral. Warren presented the case clearly, without theatrics. The forged signatures, the bank's independent confirmation, the handwriting analysis, the paper trail leading to resort charges and furniture and jewelry. Derek's attorney tried arguing implied authorization, that co-trustee status meant Derek reasonably believed he could sign on my behalf. The judge asked, flatly, whether implied authorization extended to writing someone else's name. Nobody had an answer for that. Derek stood and gave his version. Pressure, single fatherhood, always meant to repay it. Loved his grandmother. Would never have dishonored her memory on purpose. The judge listened without interrupting, then asked him one question: on how many occasions did he inform his co-trustee before making a withdrawal? None, he said, looking at the table. And the estate attorney? None. She didn't need anything else after that. Ruling from the bench, Derek removed as trustee immediately, me appointed sole trustee with full authority over remaining funds, a court-ordered accounting of the full $52,000, and a restitution plan due within 60 days. Afterward, in the hallway, Warren negotiated terms I'd already signed off on: full restitution over 5 years, no interest, no criminal forgery charge filed, and Derek's own future share of the trust redirected permanently into Bailey's education fund instead of ever coming back to him. It wasn't generous, it was practical. Prison doesn't put money back in an account. A payment plan does, and Bailey needed the money more than either of us needed to watch Derek get sentenced. My mother and I didn't speak for close to a month afterward. When she finally called, it wasn't quite an apology, but it was close. She admitted she should have asked more questions, that believing Derek had simply been easier than imagining the alternative. Derek himself went quiet for almost 2 months. No calls, no texts, nothing. Then, one Sunday evening, he called just to say he was sorry. Not the courtroom version, an actual one, quieter than I'd ever heard him. He told me Bailey had asked why she never saw me anymore, and that hearing that question was the moment it actually hit him what he'd cost her. More than the court date, more than the lawyer's bill. I told him I appreciated it, but that trust doesn't rebuild itself over one phone call, make the payments, take care of his daughter, stop performing a life he couldn't actually afford. Bailey texted me herself in October, first time ever, asking if we could get ice cream sometime. Said her dad told her to give me space, but she missed hanging out. We did, the following Saturday. She talked about her soccer season and a book she was reading for English class, never mentioned the party or the harness or any of it, until I dropped her home and she said, almost as an afterthought, standing by the car door, "Sorry about the birthday thing, I was being a brat." "Yeah, you were," I told her, and she actually laughed, first real laugh I'd heard out of her in a long time. But you're 12. That's basically the job description. It's been about 6 months now since a $300 climbing harness cracked open something that had been rotting under my family for years, quietly, while everyone pretended not to notice. Derek and I are civil, not close, and I'm not sure we ever will be again in the way we used to be, and I've made a kind of peace with that. My mother and I talk every week again, and I pick up most of the time. Bailey and I get ice cream twice a month, and I'm back at her games cheering from the same bleachers. The trust is secure. Her education fund is locked behind protections that should have existed from day one. Dual signatures, independent verification, quarterly audits, a hard cap on any disbursement without court sign-off, and Derek's 3 payments in, right on schedule. No excuses yet. Last weekend, I drove out to the cemetery and sat by my grandmother's headstone for a while, told her the money was safe, that Bailey was doing fine, doing better than fine actually, and that I was sorry it took me this long to actually pay attention instead of just glancing at a number once a year and calling it enough. The wind picked up while I sat there. A few leaves crossing the grass in front of the stone. Probably nothing. Just late October doing what late October does.